Hello, my name is Jacob Toddson. Recently, I sold nearly everything I own in order to travel Northern Europe to explore the ancient religions of the past. Today, I'm in Scotland to share with you what information I could find on the last pagan tribes of Scotland, the Picts. Now, the term Picts itself is, of course, not a good term, as many things having to do with Celtic subject material, because most of the information we have about the Picts comes from the Romans, and the Roman naming of this people group as well. So, as many of you probably know, the term Pict comes from the term Picti, which simply means to be painted. Now, this is up for debate exactly what this means, and some scholars believe this literally means to be painted with paint from the region, and that's what they would do during battles, is paint themselves. But also there is a theory that this could also mean to be tattooed, which I find quite interesting, as my newest tattoo happens to be Pictish. But regardless, it doesn't seem to be solidified whether or not Pictish or Picti means to be painted with paint or to be tattooed. Now, another thing to note when it comes to the Picts is the actual terminology for Picts is not something necessarily identified by the people from this time period. Now, the time period we're talking about is, again, up for debate, but the earliest I've seen people say that the Picts come from, and this is coming from language, is around the 3rd century, and then going all the way to around the 10th or 11th century is when the Pictish tribes kind of dissipated, the Pictish culture disappeared into Gaelic Scottish culture. And once again, the actual reason they say it's the 3rd century is this is when the artifacts that have the symbols of the Picts seem to kind of dissipate, and then the language of Picti isn't seen any further. But once again, our knowledge base is very limited. So the actual culture and traditions that eventually led to the Picts existing and the culture existing could have been around for hundreds of years beforehand. And of course, these people groups didn't pop out of nowhere. The progenitors of the Picts obviously existed, and their culture and traditions melded into what eventually is known as Pictish. It's also important to note that not all Picts got along, and the Pictish kingdoms were many. Around 7 kingdoms existed at the times of the Pictish era in Scotland. Now, you'll have to forgive me as I read you these names, because once again, I am an American, and my ability to pronounce things from around the world is not great, so I'm going to try my best. But here are the 7 known Pictish kingdoms: the Cate, the Kay, the Caircas, the Finn, or the Fife, the Foltla, or the Fortu or Fortiu. Now, these kingdoms, I will put up a map for you here so you can see it. So they're scattered across Scotland, and again, the information we have about these individual kingdoms is pretty low. Now, something I want to bring up is, since I recently visited Fort Dunad in Scotland, which is in Kilmartin Glen to the west of the Highlands, Fort Dunad is an interesting sort in this because, again, this is probably a kingdom seat, as it was a very large place and seemed to carry much importance during the Pictish era, and yet we know almost nothing about the people that actually inhabited Fort Dunad. Now, the reason I also believe that this is part of some kind of kingdom, and other people believe as well, is because of the very interesting features of Fort Dunad, including a foot spot, a foot-shaped carving hole, where someone is clearly meant to place their foot. The most commonly accepted theory of why this is here is for inaugural ceremonies involving the leadership. Fort Dunad is actually mentioned a few times in the Ulster cycle as a reference point of battles, but the actual sides of these battles are not really known. It is mentioned a second time, simply saying that it was attacked once again and that it exists. And so, again, our information is very lacking on the Fort Dunad people and who inhabited here. But a couple other characteristics that I found really interesting when visiting is the inaugural basin or bowl that has been carved near the foot pedestal that is clearly made for some kind of ceremony, most notably probably pagan in ceremony, right next to a carving of a Pictish boar, as well as some very faded examples of Ogham, the writing system of the Picts. There are very few examples of Ogham still existing, simply because it is such a very fine and fragile way of writing that's just carved on the edge of rocks, and so many examples of this have been faded and lost to time. Now, while we may know the time period that Fort Dunad was used, at least during these battles, which was around the 7th century, it's also important to note that this is the time that Christianity was already taking quite a hold in Scotland, and the Pictish tribes began to disappear. And so I can definitely say, as my understanding of the world, is if you have this foot pedestal with a basin that was probably used for at least wine, if not blood, then this place was used for pagan ceremonies. So even though the people at this time were more than likely already converted to Christianity, there was clearly a pagan element that existed at Fort Dunad at some point. And so we may say, oh, it's been around since the 7th century. Chances are the history of Fort Dunad have been around for much, much longer. Now, the final years of the Picts is very interesting because we do have a little bit more of written source material about them, but for the most part, it seems the Picts of Scotland were under the control, or at least the vassalage or tutelage, of Northumbria, and they're mentioned a few times throughout Northumbria's history and the very complicated pattern and wars and civil wars of the kingdoms that existed in England before they unified under one king. It is around this time that Gaelic immigrants were coming from Ireland bringing Christianity as well as a completely different culture. And so around this time, the Gaelic Scots began to intermingle and marry and produce children with the Picts. And within a couple hundred years, the identity of the Picts was faded away into memory, at least as early as the 10th century. So why am I finding this so interesting, and why do I want to share this with you? Well, the Picts are the last tribe or people group of Scotland that had pagan rituals and celebrated at least public forms of paganism, but yet we know so little about their pagan practice. If you actually look up very quickly the religion of ancient Scotland, it's very hard to find anything that isn't directly related to Celtic paganism. Now, Celtic paganism, of course, is going to be one of the best bets you can find, but the identity of the Celts is very different than probably the identity of the Picts, and oftentimes the practices of the Gaelic traditions and the Celtic traditions overshadow and overtake the unique identity of Scotland and the Picts. All of this comes together and for me to mention the Pictish symbols, because these symbols are beyond unique and fascinating. So I do want to go over some of these designs with you and kind of theorize with you, because we don't know the answer of why these designs exist. And some of the theories are more leaning towards cultural identity, but there also are some theories around some pagan identity to these symbols as well. Welcome to my Stone Age Blackboard here, where I'll share with you some of these mysterious symbols and we'll discuss them and the theories around them together. There have been many examples of Pictish designs found across Scotland, but one of the most concentrated collections of these symbols exists in the Scottish National Museum in Edinburgh. I highly recommend, if you're ever in Edinburgh, head to this museum, as it is free to enter, and there is such a rich collection of these ancient symbols that you can observe for as long as you like, and I think you'll be surprised at how many different artifacts come from this time period. And the most prominent design you'll see in the museum is the Pictish crescent and V-rod, one of the most common symbols to find from this era, and one I have on my body now. So obviously I was attracted to this symbol. Theories around it vary, and let me go through a couple more designs with you so you can kind of see, because they're all kind of grouped together here. So we have the Pictish crescent and V-rod, the double disc and Z-rod, very mysterious, the mirror and comb, and the serpent and Z-rod. So all of these are very interesting to me. Now, the main theory around this set of symbols is that they could be badges of office, that the crescent with the V-rod is a symbol of military leader or someone in the military, as it shows a broken arrow or a broken spear. And then you have the mirror and comb, which could designate job title or a lady of upper class standing. There's also been very crude examples found of hammers and tools, and so being badges of office may make sense. But then you throw in the double disc and Z-rod and you're like, well, what could this be? Well, this symbol is actually very interesting because there's been some theories that this represents burial chambers and ritual, and that this is more of a symbol of magical property. So perhaps this could be a symbol of someone in the priest class, perhaps, is a theory I saw. But then you also have the serpent in Z-rod here. And another theory I saw is that it could be similar to the modern symbol of medicine, Hermes' staff. And so the snake coiled around that. And so they're like, maybe it could represent something like that. But overall, the main theory around this set of symbols is that they could represent badges of office. But now we're going to throw in some more nature-based symbols that have been found as well, including the boar, the eagle, the wolf, the fish, and then the horse, unicorn, mermaid, selkie thing. So this is what really, I think, throws people off, is that you have these very abstract figures with the crescent. Remember, kids, Scotland is windy. Anyway, so yes, what I think throws people off with these symbols, while we're here waiting for the wind to subside, if you're enjoying this video, make sure you like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And if you really enjoy the content here at the Wisdom of Odin, think about supporting me on Patreon. Truly, it means a lot, it helps a lot, and I have a lot of benefits for you there as well. I also wrote a book. It's called A Yule Story. You should check it out on Amazon, and the sequel is coming out very soon. So anyways, the animals really seem to throw scholars off because they don't really know where to place them. There's obviously been connections, people saying that they're connected to druidic ceremonies, to religious ceremonies, but there's just not a lot to go off of. And there's a lot of examples examples of these in various places. But when scholars put together these organic to life animal carvings with these more abstract carvings, a theory I've seen, and one I actually kind of enjoy, is that these are actual symbols of families and clans, or at the very least early examples of clans across Scotland. Even though clans have been around really only in the Christian era, as we know, the idea of clans is probably something entrenched in Scottish history, and so these being symbols of individual families or clans in early Pictish Scotland, I think make a lot of sense. Another thing that backs this theory up is most of these things are found together in pairs. And so a theory tossed around about these symbols is that they could actually be on a stone saying, like, this person got married to this person, this family combined here. And so it's a showing of union. Now, additionally, with the theory that these represent individual families and titles, they could mark territory as well as boundaries found. Now, this isn't always supported because where we find these carvings sometimes doesn't necessarily make sense. But when we go back to Fort Dunad and the boar symbol seen there, we could draw the conclusion of saying, like, hey, the boar symbol was found here, therefore this is the symbol of those people in that area. Now, research I don't necessarily have the resources to do. It would be interesting to find out if there's groupings of these pretty close to one another. So if you had a boar symbol in Fort Dunad, are there any other boar symbols found in the area, and how far and spread out they are? Another theory I would like to share with you about these symbols is that they could be some form of hieroglyphic writing system similar to that of the Egyptians. Now, this isn't exactly a commonly accepted theory because you also have Ogham that exist within the Pictish world, and so they already had some form of writing system, but these symbols could symbolize other things within a writing system because they have been found next to each other, just like the example at Fort Dunad. Now, the crazy fun time theory that I really enjoy, of course, is that these symbols are religious in origin and come from a much older history before we have any evidence of them, and are tied to Druidic tradition, because you see the symbols move away from the animal. And I think the reasoning for this is because you see these symbols start to disappear as Christianity takes place. Now, this is hard to say if that's because they're pagan in origin, or if it's because of the Pictish people being slowly overtaken by the Gaelic Scots that came into the area. So it could be kind of one and the same, is that as this new religion came in, the old religious symbols died, and for a while you actually see them on very similar objects. You have a cross with a Pictish crescent in there as well. Again, this could be just a cultural thing then, but also it could show the transition period of religions from the pagan to the Christian. I also saw some theory that these could be connected to like celestial bodies, but I don't think there's been any evidence of that. But again, still a fun theory. While I love the theory of these being connected to some kind of religious history, again, it's just hard to say, and there's really not any one answer. There's no one answer that really takes over the others. There's a lot of supporters for everything, and I think that's what makes these symbols so popular to research, is we will most likely never know what they actually mean. And so for all I know, I put an ancient curse on my hand, but I'm hoping that the crescent and V-rod is not a symbol of an ancient curse. So really, since there's no one right answer to these ancient symbols, any theory technically can have merit as long as there's some backing to it. So let me know your crazy theories in the comments below. What do these symbols mean? I don't know. I want to know your theories. Let me know down below, and let us figure out the ancient symbols of the Picts together. We may never know the names of the gods and goddesses venerated by the Pictish people that existed in early Scotland, but what we are left with are very mysterious and magical symbols that will attract people for generations to come as we all look back at the time of the Picts.